You've been everywhere. Italy?
Yeah. Went to Italy. We went to California this weekend.
I do.
Good,
Vivek,
good.
I have to tell you, I really do kind of feel like a proud mama with you.
Oh, come on. Thank you.
Let me just start off with, have you heard of the Chinese spyware Volt Typhoon? You haven't
No, I
heard of
haven't
that?
heard of
Okay,
that
well,
specific
let me tell you
No.
like a 10-second little story real quick. So we
Sure.
have FBI Director Christopher Wray, 2 days before the House met on a Saturday to send $95 billion, most of that going to Ukraine. So 2 days before our legislators met on a Saturday to eke out this Ukraine bill, FBI Director Christopher Wray talked about, specifically, he said that the threat of China attacking our infrastructure is upon us now. He said China is looking for the right moment. He said the purpose of China releasing this spyware on our infrastructure is to create panic, chaos, and to have real world harm, to inflict real world harm on Americans. Now, this was in addition to him actually meeting with the House committee and saying the exact same thing. So, with all that information, guess what our leaders do with that information? They meet on a Saturday, 2 days later, and send $61 billion over to Ukraine. You can't make it up. And the insult to injury is when you remember that the House, although it's a slim margin, is controlled by Republicans. So I want to start off with you helping me and my audience understand, are Republicans trying to lose November? What is the reason for the disregard and the disrespect we see from our own camp to their own base?
Well, look, I think that they don't consider them their own base. I mean, that's a big part of the problem. The problem in politics, and Kathy, you know this well, and I've learned it firsthand as well, is the influence of mega outside dollars on American politics, including Republican politics. It goes for both sides of the aisle, but Republicans aren't immune from it. And so the idea that they are betraying our base actually mistakes whose base it actually is. It's the mother's milk, is money of politics. And so that's really the base. And so for people who are propelled to elected positions because of the large grassroots base of support they have, that's their base. For people who are propelled to office largely because they were able to have their coffers padded by somebody else, putting up money so they could wield them like a puppet, that's their base. So it's not, I'm not even saying that that's an insult against anybody. It's not a criticism. It's just a description of how it works. Is the person who put you in that office or the people who put you in that office are your base. And for much of the Republican Party, like the Democratic Party, that's a small base of mega donors that decide who does or doesn't make it into office. And so that's the answer to your question of the why. That's really what's at stake. Now, what makes me, I would say, sad, but crack up at the same time, Kathy, is you see people in the context of certain issues where it's politically popular pretend to be China hawks. And yet these are the same people who have said nothing about, from the spyware that you mentioned to the fact that you have 60 Chinese transformers in the electric grid of our own country. For all we know, actually, with the ability to be able to deactivate our electric grid, to be able to actually wreak significant havoc if that situation played out. That's a problem that not a single Republican touches, for example. And so when you have certain people step up and talk about, ban TikTok and, I'm going to score political points, I think it's actually just a farce, because these people, if they really cared about the Chinese risk, would be taking a look at our own hard infrastructure, our own military industrial base, our own pharmaceutical supply chain, our own semiconductor supply chain that depend on adversaries or potential adversaries for our modern way of life. That's the real challenge that, frankly, leaders in both parties have been too afraid and too beholden to address. And I think a big part of this does come down to the influence of mega money in politics.
And so the obvious answer, if we follow if we agree with you, which I do, is to get big money, big donor money out of politics. But what is the likelihood of the fox actually doing what is necessary while he's in the hen house?
I think it's unlikely is the answer to that question. But the more you call it out, the harder it becomes to sustain the charade. Now, people say, okay, well, there's complex First Amendment jurisprudence here. You got Citizens United, which say that, we have a free speech right to express ourselves. Let's just delve into that in a little bit of detail. I come at this,
Right.
and I know I'm talking to one as well. I'm talking to a free speech, I call myself a free speech absolutist. So I'm an ardent defender of the First Amendment. So how do you square that with what you think of as limitations on how much people are able to give to super PACs, or the limitation of the influence of a super PAC on a campaign? Here's the answer to that. What the Supreme Court held in Citizens United is even limitations on how much somebody can contribute to a campaign is actually perfectly legitimate. So the idea is there should not be an undue influence of money on a particular candidate. That was the premise in Citizens United. But you could give money to these independent entities called super PACs because those weren't advocating for a specific campaign. Well, if you fast forward 14 years later, what you see is actually many of those campaigns, even at the presidential level, are effectively being run by super PACs. You saw that for certain candidates in the Republican primary. You see it in the Democratic primaries. You see it in the general elections of many other races at lower levels across this country. And so against that backdrop, I think all we got to do is apply the same standard to super PACs as we do to campaign contributions. That if you're really giving to an entity that does not advocate for specific candidates, if it's not naming specific candidates either for or against them, but just advocating for an issue, say issues relating to Second Amendment protections or pro-life causes or whatever it is, or it doesn't matter, the other side of those causes too, you're unlimited in the amount you can give because that's what it means to be a free speech proponent or proponent of particular forms of speech. But if it is giving effectively to a super PAC that's supporting a particular candidate, you're just subject to the same restraints as you are if you're giving to the candidate themselves, which is whatever the limit is for that particular election. So it's not too complicated. But I think the reason we're doing it is,
I don't know if you've heard the recent
corruption.
story about the OnlyFans creator coming forward saying that the Biden administration paid her money behind the scenes to essentially advocate and to campaign on his behalf. But I know I have you for a short period of time, so let me jump over and double click on your statement about free speech, being a free speech absolutist, because on any other given, what's today, Tuesday, I would agree with you. And I know what you generally say, that the answer to hate speech is not less speech, but more speech. And again, I agree with that.
Yeah.
But, and I'm going to say this not to be insightful or any of that, but I don't live in a bubble. I actually read and study, and I love history. And I remember watching many years ago, over a decade ago, Hitler's youth camp. They were called Hitler's Youth. I don't know if you've heard of them. But essentially, this was a group designed to indoctrinate children, young people, with Hitler's ideology. And then he would send them back off into the world, back out into Germany, back into the war. And so now so imagine, if you will, if we pick Hitler's youth, brought them to America, now they're under the protection of the Constitution. Would we still say that their expression is protected speech, or can we somehow stand to the side and say, wait a minute, I know the end of this speech, like I know the end of progressivism. They will weaponize the Constitution, but their real aim is to dismantle the U.S. Constitution. So help us parse that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So look, I think that you got to go to the root cause, which was the government indoctrination in the first place. The equivalent of that, not in the same degree, but the equivalent, at least analogy in the United States, is government institutions like the U.S. Department of Education, which are using taxpayer money as a cudgel, as a stick to be able to get local schools to adopt those indoctrinating agendas at the local level. Right answer, get rid of that bureaucracy. The same thing you could see in terms of the U.S. military, the indoctrination of the DEI agenda or the woke indoctrination that you see in the military. Again, stop it at the level of the indoctrination. I'm personally not a fan of going to the back end of saying, okay, well, then if you disagree with that speech, the right answer is to limit the speech. The real answer is to limit the government indoctrination in the first place, because the government shouldn't be playing that role in the first place. And the irony is, in the name of actually protecting free speech rights for certain views, what we're really seeing is censorship of the other view. So that's a big part of why the left-wing orthodoxies are able to prevail as much as they are, Kathy, is not because we don't have sufficient censorship of them, but because we do have too much censorship of the countervailing views. Not direct censorship always. Sometimes it is direct censorship. But backdoor censorship.
What do we do in the immediate?
Use of threats.
Because right now, whether it's 2020 Summer of Love, where you saw Antifa donning masks, beating people in the street, Black Lives Matter, destroying personal property. Now, We have college students under the guise of just
Right.
freedom of expression, intimidating, threatening, but claiming ignorance at the same time and protection of our Constitution. What do we do when we see that this isn't just rhetoric being done in an isolated manner, but we see it being filtrated through ESG and corporations and the government and the weaponization of laws and censoring certain people?
Yep.
What do we do? Just stand back and look at it and call it protected speech?
No, the correct answer is enforce the law. The law actually permits you to express an opinion. It does not protect your right to obstruct somebody else's expression of theirs or obstructing somebody else's going on of their own, carrying out the course of an educational institution or a company for that matter. And so I think part of what we're seeing is in the name of free speech, we've actually somehow temporarily legitimized vandalism, legitimized the kind of behavior you saw in the summer of 2020. Free speech protection means that any opinion goes, that you can't have somebody in an open space with the appropriate criteria for being able to speak in a public square, holding up a sign, no matter how heinous the content of what's written on that sign, that means you get to say it. That does not mean you get to disrupt somebody else's ability to enter that building, or somebody else's ability to go to a classroom, or somebody else's ability to get an education or conduct their business, or to have their storefronts not be, let's just say, desecrated with graffiti or broken into. That's a big part of the problem. So that's the distinction we need to draw, is we enforce the rule of law. If you're breaking the law, not expressing an opinion, but you're going further than that to break the law, we're failing to enforce that. And the irony is on the other side, even when people are just expressing speech online or on the internet, not breaking any laws, we're actually seeing backdoor censorship of those views by threatening tech companies to take it down or debanking people for expressing those views. So that's the combination that gets us to where we are, which is where we feel like we are actually being betrayed. We feel like these views need to be censored on the other side because it's all we're hearing. The real solution to the problem is stop the censorship on the other side and enforce the law when there are breakages of the rule of law. And that's
so we really have to
right
work against that knee-jerk instinct to shut this speech down. But how do you...
Well, I would say less, and it's not just not against that knee-jerk instinct, but what should we have a knee-jerk to do is actually enforce the law as it exists today.
But what about when you have
and I think that we're not doing enough of that.
Who won't even secure your own border in light of the FBI director
that means they don't respect the rule of
China
law.
Will strike at any moment now.
Well, I think part of the reason you see a violent wave of crime across this country, Kathy, is that once you see even the top law enforcement institutions in this country themselves abandoning the rule of law, from the Department of Homeland Security to the FBI, then you have ordinary criminals saying, well, if they're not going to follow the rule of law, why the heck should I, if those are the top law enforcement agencies in the country? And so it's a culture of the abandonment of the rule of law. And I think, ironically, we've abandoned both our culture of free speech and our culture of the enforcement of the rule of law at the same time. And I think that to bring this country back, we're going to have to revive those base principles that the country was founded on in the first place. That you do believe in the rule of law. That you enter this country, if you want to, legally through the front door, not through the back door. That you do get to express any opinion, whether it's right wing or left wing. You get to express that opinion without government retaliation through the front door or back door. Merit, the basic idea that the elected leaders we elect to run the government should actually run the government rather than the bureaucrats sitting in that FBI or DHS that are ignoring the rule of law. Those are the base principles that we need to revive. And if we do, we're going to have a country. And if we don't, we don't have that country left. That's as simple as the choice we face right now.
Really quick question before you go. I asked my 40,000+ followers on Substack email list to send me a question to ask you. I'm going to go... the question most people asked was, what position would you be willing to take in President Trump's administration? Are you having any conversations about VP pick, which is my hope? What say you?
Well, look, I've had some good conversations with President Trump since dropping out of the race and since I've endorsed him. And I do think it's vital that he be elected as the next president. First, I think it's important not to count your chickens before they hatch. I think it's going to be a very challenging 7 months ahead. And I do see somewhat of a culture of complacency developing in our own party and our own movement that we got to reject. I think that we're in the early innings of the tricks the other side is going to pull. And, I think it's far from a foregone conclusion that Biden's even going to be the nominee. So that's where my focus is. Now, should Trump be reelected? Look, I'm going to look at how am I able to have the maximal impact on the country and make that second term even more successful than his first term. a lot of different ways to do that. I think that two of the things I'm pretty focused on are what I think of as the two mass deportations that we need in this country. The first mass deportation is the deportation of anybody who's in this country illegally, being returned to their country of origin and building that southern border wall and sealing it with our own military. That's the first mass deportation. But I often say don't forget the second one as well, which is the mass deportation of those 3 million plus federal bureaucrats out of that Washington,
Now, let
D.C.
me ask
bureaucracy.
you about that
And I think
first
that's
deportation.
essential,
Do you really
actually, to
think
get
the
done.
American
Yeah.
people have the stomach to deport 10, 20? Who knows? Like, no one really knows how many illegals have come into our country. But do you really think we have the stomach after, MSNBC put up one video of a child crying? Do you really think that we have the stomach to do it, or we stuck with these illegals in our country?
No, I think we do have the stomach to do it. Actually, there was Axios and some others published a survey just last week, Kathy, which found that it was 52% of Democrats. So you got the general population, but you got about half of Democrats were in favor of mass deportations. Now, Axios, of course, put their spin on it, the harshest of the Republican immigration policies. Well, my point is it's not that harsh if a majority of Americans and even half of Democrats are in favor of it. I'll also give you an interesting fact that a lot of people may not be aware of. There's over 1 million people in this country that have already had a final order of removal, which means they've gone through the full appeals process, through the court system of all the protection, and they're still in this country, right? And so I think that there is a rational way when you go through the sequence of this. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. And when people see we can get that done, I think they'll have the confidence that we're able to go the distance and get the full rule of law enforced in this country, too.
Just two more quick questions.
Pretty
Milo
optimistic about
out of
that.
Bucks County wanted to know, oh my goodness, where is it? Here it is. Does Russia actually pose a threat to the rest of Europe?
Look, I think the real threat we need to focus on is China. The reality is we're pushing Russia further into China's hands. So the real threat, not only to Europe, but to the rest of the world, is the growing strength of the Russia-China relationship. And the irony is it's really our own boneheaded foreign policy that's pushing Russia further into China's hands. And my view is we have a rare opportunity to disentangle them. The question is, do we seize it?
Last question. What keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night is, I think about my own life. I mean, I know I'm young, I'm 38, but I think I've, at this point, Kathy, I really mean this when I say this, is think about the career that I've had, the upbringing I've had. Now we've brought 2 children into this world. I've lived a happy life and achieved everything that I would wish to out of a life. And the rest is bonus for me. That's the way I look at it. What keeps me up at night is that our kids are not going to be able to grow up in that same country or that same world. And what keeps me up is the fact that it's one thing if that's already the foreordained conclusion, there's nothing we can do about it, but we can do something about it right now. We have our last opportunity to restore what I think is the greatest country known to mankind, and yet we are on the cusp of squandering it. So it's not just the fact that the country isn't going to exist, it's the fact that we can do something about it right now, and yet we're still failing to. And it's when you have that sense of agency. Otherwise, you could just sleep soundly at night knowing that, the whole ball game doesn't matter anyway. But right now, we know we can change it. The question is, what can we do? Each of us playing our part, me playing my part, to make sure we pass that on to our kids. And that's what keeps me up, but it's also what keeps me going. And in a certain sense, that's the positive side of this too. 1776 was a pretty special time to be alive. And I think 2024 can be too, if we seize the opportunity to make the sacrifices and take the risks needed to play our part.
Vivek, I appreciate you. I appreciate Apoorva, Karthik, Arjun. I love watching the videos of the boys. They're growing up so fast. I truly appreciate you and your boldness to be among the very few in the Republican camp who will actually speak truth unapologetically. We need more of that, and I appreciate you.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate you back, and keep up the good work, and I'm sure we'll talk again soon.
Keep it up, my friend. Blessings.